This is part B of the lecture on the Umayyad Caliphate for History 226. Remember, I started out this lecture on the Umayyads by talking about three gigantic problems that the Umayyad rulers faced and that really concentrated that took a lot of their efforts. And all three of them were to have some role in the eventual revolution that overthrew the Umayyads. So I'd like to spend some time on each of these three. The first of those three was the problem of dealing with the increasing social diversity of the empire. Keep in mind the expansion that had been taking place from 632 on. From 632 through 715, the Arabs conquered over 4.5 million square miles of territory. On average, that was 150 square miles every day for 83 years, though those conquests went faster before the Umayyads than after their ascent. Still, this was a mushrooming empire, and that was in itself a gigantic problem. Under the Umayyad dynasty, the areas that are shown in green on this map were the ones that were added. That included Western North Africa, that is the Maghreb, also parts of Spain, and there were many military forays into Spain. There were parts of northeastern Persia, particularly the area known as Khorasan. Then parts of the northwestern Indian cultural area. This includes areas that are presently in Pakistan, and also areas that are presently part of Afghanistan, and some other parts of Central Asia were also added to the empire at the time of the Umayyads. It would be remarkable if that kind of broad and, I would say, mushrooming dominion did not change things in government and in society. Empire almost always changes domestic politics. It, for example, helped to transform the Roman Republic into an empire ruled by dictator emperors. And I would say also the global reach of the United States, the kind of informal empire that the United States deals with, has certainly changed a lot of things in the United States. The attack on the buildings in New York and Washington and so on in 9/11 called forth all kinds of measures that changed the concept of citizenship in the United States. For example, it came to be the case that there were American citizens held without trial, and there was also treatment of prisoners of a type that was not known commonly, even in World War II. For example, the use of torture, waterboarding, something for which the United States occupation of Japan tried Japanese for doing. Now the United States was practicing against so-called enemy combatants, as they were called. Also, you have the first cases under President Obama of American drones bombing and killing American citizens, the decision for this having been made without trial. I mentioned earlier the holding of citizens without charges, also without access to lawyers, things like that. So certainly the American informal empire and reaction to it has changed some things in the United States and for the United States. And it's certainly changed things in this empire that we're dealing with here, that is the Arab state ruled by the Umayyads. Muawiyah had relied on Syrian-based Arab armies to construct this empire under his control. His top advisors and officials came largely from that background, and there was resentment elsewhere in the empire, especially in Iraq and in Khorasan, about Syrian hegemony and privilege. There were questions of fairness. And also, one of the things that took place eventually under the Umayyads was Arabization. I had mentioned that as something that took place under the Marwanids. Although in the first few years the Umayyads had relied on some of the old bureaucrats who had served, for example, the Byzantine Empire, and that included some Christian officials, and there were also some Jewish people that ended up as officials. But all of that would eventually change. The Marwanids followed a policy of Arabization of administration. Arabic language took over in documents, and non-Arabs were either forced to learn Arabic or they were elbowed out. And also non-Muslims were eventually elbowed out. There were issues surrounding the treatment of non-Muslims and also treatment of people who converted to Islam. As for the non-Muslims, here we're dealing with the so-called dhimmi. I guess I've skipped this area above. Anwar al-Awlaki was an American who was killed by an American drone at the behest of President Obama. He was a member of Al-Qaeda. He is the first American who was executed without trial that I know of, anyway. At any rate, getting back to the dhimmi that I had begun to talk about, the dhimmi are the so-called peoples of the book that the Arab Muslim state had offered protection to. They were essentially second-class citizens, though in some ways treated better than many other empires had treated people of other religion or other culture that were conquered. At any rate, Christians and Jews, if they paid the jizya, the poll tax, were in that protected status, also that second-class status. These non-Muslims were required to pay the poll tax, the jizya, as well as the land tax and whatever other taxes had survived from the Byzantine Empire. I might also add that Zoroastrians, Zoroastrians, Zoroastrians embraced a religion that some of the time was recognized as a religion of the book, and they were allowed to be treated as dhimmi. But there were special disadvantages besides the jizya and paying land tax, because by and large Arabs who owned land at this time were not subject to the land tax. So this was a special burden on non-Arabs, at least for a time. At any rate, there were other special disadvantages faced by non-Muslims. For example, there were laws against bearing arms by non-Muslims. There were sumptuary regulations, sumptuary, sumptuary regulations, which regulated what kind of clothing a person could wear depending upon their religion or background, what kind of hairdos people could have. Basically, sumptuary regulations have to do with things you can buy and own. It did have some regulation on the kind of houses that a person could have. Non-Muslims, this is getting beyond sumptuary regulations, were not allowed to hold public office. That is, after a while, that was true in the Umayyad dynasty. They were not allowed to give evidence against Muslims. Also, it became a regulation that church buildings were not allowed to be repaired. And some congregations were allowed to buy exceptions to this policy. So one of the issues under the Umayyads was treatment of non-Muslims. I guess I didn't mention another one of the disadvantages. Under Umar II, it was ruled that non-Muslims could not ride horses. They could only ride mules. Those poor mules had to deal with those non-Muslims. Anyway, in addition to the issue of treatment of non-Muslims, there was the matter of the conversion of conquered peoples. This Islamization of conquered peoples posed special problems. Many of those non-Muslims who converted became mawali. That's the plural for it. And mawla is the singular for it. Gets translated as either clients or freemen. These people often were attached to one or another of the Arab tribes or clans. By 800 AD, this is after the end of the Umayyad period, non-Arab Muslims by that time outnumbered Arab Muslims. That practice had been going on for some time during the Umayyad period. The non-Arab Muslims were still a minority of the population of the empire by the 800s. In other words, non-Muslims were still the majority. But at any rate, those newly converted Muslims found themselves, as a general rule, facing all kinds of disadvantages compared to the Arab Muslims. For one thing, very few, if any of them, ended up being included on the Diwan, that list of pensioners. The Diwan had become a hereditary privilege, so that the heirs of someone who had been on the Diwan, pretty much all of them Arabs, maybe a few non-Arabs got on it, but they were the ones who were on the pension list. And there was resentment at that by the Muslim converts from Persia or other places, that they could not be on the Diwan and get the income that came from that. There was also resentment at the taxes that most typically the non-Arab converts would have to pay and the Arabs would not. For example, land taxes. For the most part, Arab landowners, Arabs who managed to get their hands on land, mostly managed not to pay the land taxes, while those Persians, for example, who converted to Islam, mostly ended up still paying those land taxes. To be sure, there were some of these new converts who escaped land taxes. There were enough of them that it caused a serious shortfall in revenues. There was also some of the converts who left the land to go to the city in hopes of somehow finding a way to get on the Diwan, to get state annuities. Now, few of them succeeded, but enough of them left the land for this purpose to hurt state revenues. When they left the land, they stopped paying both the poll tax and the land tax. Now, as I said, some Arab Muslims acquired land, and there was growing interpenetration of Arabs and natives of Persia as well as other areas. And there was resentment by non-Arab Muslims that they were still taxed, and for the most part, the Arabs were not. Umar II, who reigned from 717 through 720, tried to solve this problem of resentment by freeing all Muslims from both the poll tax and the land tax. The result was predictable: an immediate revenue crisis, and therefore something had to be done to reverse that. And the Caliph Hisham, I guess it's pronounced, the accent on the last syllable, set the policy which held in most lands thereafter that although the jizya, the poll tax, ended when one converted, land taxes did not. At any rate, there were inequalities, and there was dissatisfaction by non-Arab Muslims, many of whom were the major landowners, for example, in what had been Persia, and some of this was going to play a role in the eventual overthrow of the Umayyads. Now, I might fast forward ahead to the period after the Umayyads had been overthrown, and you had the Abbasid dynasty in power. It was the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mutasim who ruled from 834 through 841, who finally abolished the Diwan system. He came to rely on tribal Turkish armies, and they replaced armies that had been paid for in part by the land taxes we talked about before. And because he was relying on these armies, he didn't have to cater to the Arab families that had provided armies in the past. Some of those armies were still around at that time, the Abbasid period. But at any rate, he finally did away with the Diwan system. So that problem A, the first problem that I had mentioned earlier, that is the growth of the empire and the resentments and inequalities that it entailed, that was a serious problem for the rulers to deal with. But I would add that those landowners, those large Persian landowners who were disgruntled about their unequal treatment, were also, some of them, part of the next grouping that I'm going to talk about, and that is the piety-minded opposition. So this is the second major problem that the Umayyads had to deal with, really off and on throughout the dynasty, through the period of the dynasty. Let me deal first with the Alids. These are the descendants and followers of the descendants of Ali, people loyal to the Alids. They are the proto-Shiites. They are the grouping that eventually becomes the Shiite branch of Islam. They tended to be very piety-minded, and they tended to feel that the Umayyad rulers were not pious. They were not religious, not sufficiently religiously pious. And therefore, they were not proper rulers, thought these Alids. They also felt that they were not the legitimate successors of Muhammad and Ali, who they had seen as legitimate rulers. Remember, Muawiyah, the first of the Umayyads, had placed his son Yazid as his successor. Muawiyah had controlled the Alids with the force of his personality and also with the threat of the use of force. After his death, though, the party of Ali became a big problem again, and Muawiyah's son, Yazid, faced considerable dissent against him around the empire as he tried to rule. And the upshot is going to be what is called the second fitna. Fitna is a term that sometimes gets translated as civil war. And from roughly 680 through 692, you have civil war going on. Muawiyah's defeat of Ali had not put an end to the forces behind the Ali challenge to the Umayyads. Ali's son, Hussein, Muhammad's grandson, led a rebellion against Yazid. And he had various parts of the general public that he could appeal to get followers to fight against Yazid. For one thing, people in Medina resented the way that they had been treated up until this point by the Quraysh, by that major tribe from Mecca. They felt that they, the Medinans, had been the ones who had sheltered Muhammad and had fought for him, and they felt that the Quraysh had come after the victory of Muhammad, had come to usurp the place of the Medinans in the body politic. In addition to this, there were a lot of rumors spread by the Alids as well as others about Yazid's dissolute lifestyle. He was a drinker, and if the opposition propaganda about him is to be believed, his depravity extended to all aspects of his life. Now, it is impossible to separate truth from fiction. I will later recount some of the charges against him by his enemies, but we can't really know whether these charges are true or not. Let me skip talking about that for now and simply say that Ali's son, Hussein, had agreed to lead the battle against Yazid. So he marched from Medina to what is now Iraq, first to Kufa, where he took the lead of a bunch of opposition forces, and then he marched on, and he and his small party, a party which tradition says was 72 men, was intercepted and massacred by Yazid's forces at the city of Karbala in Iraq in 680. Traditional accounts say that Hussein and his 72 men were massacred by a force around 10,000. So it was more of a massacre than a battle, according to the accounts that we get. In the eyes of the Alids, this was martyrdom, on the part of Hussein. His death at the hands of the Umayyads divides Muslims more than any other single event in history. The followers of Hussein eventually become the Shiites. The followers of the Umayyad dynasty, the ones who accepted their legitimacy, eventually become known as the Sunnis. But this event, the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala, is the anniversaries of it are treated as a holy day in Shiite Islam. Ashura is the name of this holy day. It falls on the 10th day of the month of Muharram, and on that day, around the Shiite world, you see public displays of young men walking around and marching in files with their backs bared, whipping themselves with metal whips that they whip on their back. There's also passion plays which relive the martyrdom. So this is a big event of remembrance in Shiite Islam. Well, anyway, Hussein's forces were defeated, but that doesn't mean that the opposition to Yazid was defeated, because another leader stood up and led armies against the Umayyads. The next leader of these opposition forces was Abdullah ibn al-Zubair. He was a son of the man named Zubair al-Zubair, who was killed in the Battle of the Camel in 683. He had been one of the first to encourage Hussein to challenge Yazid. And this man never recognized Yazid as the caliph. Well, Abdullah had support in Arabia, in Mecca and Medina. He claimed to be the proper caliph himself. He publicly repudiated Yazid in an insulting sermon, referring to Yazid's dissolute lifestyle. And here's a quotation from that sermon, supposedly. Yazid of liquors, Yazid of whoring, Yazid of panthers, Yazid of dogs. These last two items were basically implying that Yazid was guilty of bestiality. Yazid of barren deserts. Well, anyway, the forces of Yazid and those of Abdullah squared off against each other militarily, but Yazid died before either side won conclusively. Before Yazid died, he appointed his weak teenage son, Muayyad II, as his successor as caliph, and then proceeded a long civil war, which is part of that second fitna that I talked about before. In this case, it's between Abdullah ibn al-Zubair and the Umayyads. That son of Yazid died in fairly short order. This ended the Sufyanid line of the Umayyads, and succession dispute was carried forward until, remember, the Marwanid line came to the throne of Caliph. I might mention that the war between these two sides included a factional aspect to it. or some might say a tribal aspect to it. The army that Muawiyah, that Syrian army that he had depended upon, had been in the process of dividing into two major factions, the Qais and the Kalb. The Qais is sometimes called the Northern Arabian faction or tribe, and the Kalb is often referred to as the Yemeni or the Southern Arabian faction or tribe. At any rate, we are told that Yazid was close to the Kalb or Yemeni faction, and Abdullah depended heavily on the Qais. That is actually bringing us to a topic I'll deal with in just a little bit, and that is factionalism within the Arab armies. Before I do that, though, I need to talk about I need to mention that in 692, a general sent by Abdul Malik, thought I had put that, I know I had put it in here. Well, you remember Abdul Malik, who had been the caliph, the important caliph in the Marwanid period. He has sent the general that eventually defeated Abdullah's rebellion. Oh, here it is. That's I didn't see it right there. It was right in front of my face. Right, there it is, at the bottom of this list on the right. So Abdullah's uprising was defeated. There is another couple piety-minded groups that I need to talk about who took exception to Umayyad rule. One of them was the Kharijites, who we've talked about earlier in relation to the fight between Ali and Muawiyah. There were several uprisings of Kharijites against the Umayyad rulers. The Kharijites believed that people had to decide for themselves who was most morally fit, and they would elect him as a leader. At least there would be a council that would elect the ruler based on religious and moral criteria. And they believed that the Umayyad leaders fell far short on both the religious and moral standards. Kharijites believed that a ruler who was immoral was not only not legitimately a ruler, but he was also not a Muslim. At any rate, Kharijites set up their own little communities, some of them armed. For some time, the Kharijites were kind of separatistic from other Muslims, looking upon those around them as non-Muslim or un-Muslim. And they were against the special favors and privileges that Arab Muslims had. They thought that all real Muslims should be treated alike. There should be no inequalities amongst Muslims. So one of the piety-minded groups that was a headache for the Umayyads was the Kharijites. Sometimes it ended up in military conflict. There was another group, though, that spread dissension. And these people were not Alids. They were not kind of proto-Shiites. They were Sunnis, but they were learned people, religiously learned. Here I'm talking about the ulama. By the early 700s at least, you have the rise of the ulama, that religiously learned group in Sunni Islam that included, for example, jurists. They were in the process of creating Sharia, Sharia, Islamic law. They became experts in that legal system, and they based their opposition and criticism of the regime on their understanding of the moral notions in the practices of Muhammad, that is the Sunnah, Sunna, and in the Hadith, Hadith, that oral tradition which told the stories of what Muhammad had said and done. And the ulama used these stories that had been passed on, that is the Hadith, their knowledge of that, their knowledge of the Hadith, as one of the standards by which they judged the Umayyad rulers to be really not fit in their moral standards, moral standing. So these people are developing the Sunni tradition in Islam. Well, let me move on to the third of those three problems that the Umayyad rulers faced, and that is factionalism within the army, amongst the Arab armies, or within the Arab armies. The Umayyad rulers faced some military difficulties. In 717, their armies were defeated by Leo III, Leo the Isaurian, who was Byzantine emperor. And this became a kind of crisis in the power of the Umayyads, and the fact that their armies had lost, very visibly lost, against the Umayyads, and important territory had been lost. The Umayyad rulers lost a lot of their prestige, a lot of their charisma. So that hastened the decline of the Umayyads. But also, in time, the battle, the factional battle between two different, sometimes they're called tribes, sometimes it's called factions, within the Arab armies that the Umayyad state depended upon. That is, the split between the Qais and the Kalb really weakened Umayyad power. The Umayyad leaders found themselves kind of tap dancing, trying to parry and play with each of these two groups. They tried to do it without, the caliphs tried to do it without becoming a captive of either of the two factions, but much of the time there was kind of a general public sense that the regime was either favoring the Kalb or, on the other hand, was favoring the Qais. And all you had to look at was the appointments to high office that were being made. It was the case that emperors, despite their knowledge that they had to somehow not become the captive of either faction, they sort of did, though it was not always the same faction. I've already mentioned early on Yazid's connection to the Kalb. As time went on, by the late Umayyad period, the Umayyad state was seen as being too cozy with the Qais. And the Kalb, or Yemeni, are going to play a role in the uprising that eventually overthrew the Umayyad dynasty. So this factionalism with the army, within the army, is one of the things which helped to bring down the Umayyad state. The rebels were going to be able to depend on As it turned out, they were going to be able to depend on the Kalb, the Yemeni, or at least some of the Yemeni elements in the army. And that is going to really be the end. It's going to seal the fate of the Umayyad state. I'll say some more about that when I talk about the Abbasid Revolution, but at any rate, this is the end of Part B of the lecture on the Umayyad dynasty.